Hey guys, I want to welcome you to week 2 of our journey through the Gospels. And today we find ourselves in Matthew chapter 7. And Matthew chapter 7 is the conclusion of Jesus' famous Sermon on the Mount, which started in Matthew chapter 5. And the part of the chapter that I want to look at is the very end, starting in verse 24. And it is that part of the sermon that, as a preacher, you would call the conclusion. And it's really that part of the sermon where you're trying to wrap up everything. You're trying to bring everything in and trying to wrap everything up. You're trying to bring the plane in for a landing, so to speak. And you really want to answer the question for the listener, now what? You really want to make sure that you leave the listener with an application of something to do with the message, because a sermon should not just be information, although it is informational, but there needs to be an aspect of something that you're to do with it. What are you supposed to do in your life with it? And Jesus does that at this part of the chapter, verse 24. He says, "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash." As Jesus wraps up his sermon and is talking to his audience, he basically gives them the old Nike slogan, "Now that you've heard what I've said, just do it. Just put it into practice in your life." And he says it in this way and essentially speaks to two types of listeners in his audience. And he says, guys, there are some of you in this audience, you have heard my teachings, but you're going to go home and you're not going to do anything with them. You've heard all the wise things that I've said, but you're going to take that information that you now have and you're going to do nothing with it. That's foolish. And he says, but then there are others of you, you have heard my teachings, you're going to put it into practice in your life. You're going to do something with it. You're going to work it into your life. And he said, those of you that do that, you are wise. Because see, here's the thing. God's given us his word to read, and every time we read, every time we listen to a sermon, we need to ask ourselves this question: God, what is it that you want me to do with this word that you've given to me? What is it you want me to do in my life? Because I believe that God has given us his word not just for information, but he's given it to us to show us what he expects of us in our lives. He's given us an expectation that he has for us of what he wants us to do in our lives. And that it's not just for information, but it's to put into practice somewhere in our lives. And so listen to what this passage says in the Message. I want to read it to you, what Jesus says in verse 26 and 27 when he's talking about the fool. It says, "But if you just use my words in Bible studies and don't work them into your life, you're like a stupid carpenter who built his house on the sandy beach. When a storm rolled in and the waves came up, it collapsed like a house of cards. But if you just use my words in Bible studies and don't work them into your life, you're like a stupid carpenter. You're a fool." And his point is this, is that we shouldn't just get into his word just for Bible studies and just to get information, but it's to put it into practice in our lives. So I want to encourage you, or I want to challenge you, every day on this journey to ask yourself this question at the end of every chapter: God, what is it that you want me to do with what I have learned in this passage today? Because I believe that every day there's going to be at least one thing that God wants to teach you and show you, and that he wants you to put into practice in your life. And according to Jesus' own words, if we will do that and put it into practice in our lives, then we will be considered wise. And that's it for today. And I hope that you will join us tomorrow as we look at Matthew chapter 8. Have a great day. See you tomorrow.